Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you're having a wonderful day today. Today, we are going to be talking about the Glock AR. It is, in fact, real and it can hurt you. But before we get into all that, go ahead and like, share, and subscribe, as that is all free and does help us out quite a bit. Now, getting into exactly what we're talking about here, the Glock AR has been spotted out in the wild of Slovakia, which we'll get into the reason for that in just a minute. A few pictures have been posted and floating around of police units actually using them, holding them out in the wild as apparently contract rifles, and these are allegedly the famous Glock rifles. While these rifles might be new to us here in the States, over in Europe, these have been out for about 2 years now and starting to win some contracts, so you're definitely going to see these floating around with a bit more frequency. A couple years ago, these were also entered into a British contract for one of their military service rifles. I'm not sure whether or not they ended up winning, but this is actually pictures that were floating around about 2 years ago, and since then, not much has changed. Now, very importantly, Glock has been developing these for approximately 6 years, if not a little bit longer than that. They've been filing patents, winning a lot of patents for a lot of their barrels and triggers and bolts and all sorts of different fun components that go into their AR-15. I've had it confirmed mostly through inside sources that a lot of the parts are actually going to be machined in-house by Glock rather than just third-party manufactured, and then Glock slaps its label on it and you pay, double the price of what it should be. And these should actually be relatively affordable for a high-end European AR with a few interesting twists. Fortunately, you can find a lot of these patents floating around, and you can actually take a look at some of these components, or at least the prints of the components, and get a short synopsis of what they're supposed to do. If you're very mechanically inclined, you'll probably be able to make more sense of it than not, but if you're somebody like me, it might look a little bit more like gibberish. But here we have a trigger, we have a bolt, we have another trigger, secondary handguard mount, bolt catcher firearm with barrel clamp, which is going to be integral to the way that the system actually works, connection for upper receiver and lower, mounting device for weapon accessories, triggers. You can see that it kind of goes on and on with some of the other designs. Now, fortunately, we have more than just basic synopsises. You can actually go in and see their print readouts and hopefully get a little bit more detail as to what they're actually trying to do. You can see this is what appears to be a barrel assembly and extension, which is quite unique when it comes to an AR-15 like program, and you can get very, very detailed in all of the designs and readout. Here we have for the ejection system, which is again quite unique. We see we have a internal recoil system that doesn't seem to use a buffer, at least on this specific unit. Who knows what is actually going into production for what rifle and what actually makes it to the shelf for you and I. Now, the reason that I say makes it to the shelf for you and I is that allegedly these actually have been approved for input, at least partially, so we are in fact going to be getting the Glock ARs in the US at some point in the future for around the $2,000 price tag. Here are some very interesting images. This is a firearm with a gas drive, so this is essentially a piston system of some sort with a very unique gas block and a way to attach it to the rifle. I believe it is, of course, all adjustable. And again, if you're more mechanically inclined than I am, a little bit more intelligent, probably wouldn't hurt, but you can probably figure out what you're actually looking at. Here we can see the extension on the barrel, the way that the bolt interfaces. It's very different than a standard AR-15, which is good and bad. AR-15 is very well known, it's very reliable, it's a mature product line. When you try and innovate and do something a little bit wacky, sometimes you can get good results, and sometimes not so much. And again, we have lists and lists of these things for bolt catches, for magazine holders. We have trigger units, which looks very standard for the most part, but apparently they're coming out with their own special little tweaks that warrant a patent, or at least attempting to get a patent. Now, their handguard system, which I suppose we should talk about, the handguard is very similar to the HK416, which has a single screw that clamps the handguard down to the barrel nut that also integrates with the upper receiver indexes, kind of like a Geisley Super Duty, and makes it that it's a very aligned, very rigid system. Now, again, it's not quite the same on the Glock system as it is with the HK system, but it's similar, although the barrel integrates differently, so it's different enough to probably warrant its own patent. It makes sense. Glock is attempting to get as many patents as possible, not saying that they're going to win every single one of these, but at least trying to get all of them, and that will protect them in the future. Even the way that the bolt locks up in a standard or a more standard barrel extension on an AR-15, they are attempting to get that patented, or at least a specific element of it, kind of like Knights or LMT or anybody that does something a little bit different with their bolt and barrel assemblies. While that might seem very cool to you, you're going to get a Glock AR in America in the future at an undetermined point in time at an undetermined price tag. Why is it currently sitting in Slovakian police officers' hands and allegedly being made or assembled in Slovakia at the least? Well, as far as I understand it, as a non expert in European firearms laws and import and export restrictions, it is rather difficult for Austria, even though they're part of the EU, to export firearms to other countries. So, having a facility very close that kind of acts like a sister facility in Slovakia, where labor is also much cheaper than it is in Austria, allows them to have a second avenue for distribution and for production, so that if something happens in Austria, they aren't shut down completely. They have a secondary place that may be a little bit easier to export firearms from. You can actually find Slovakian assembled Glocks in places like South Africa, where for whatever reason it's easier to export them from Slovakia than it is for Austria, or to just meet demands in different markets. That's probably a large part of the reason that you see them in Slovakian police officer hands, is because they're assembled in Slovakia, so it makes sense to keep that money in country and to have a service rifle that's actually made in your home country, even if the parent company is Austrian. It is an if, but if Glock is able to get around EU, Austrian, and Slovakian export restrictions and somehow get it approved by the ATF as well for input, then yes, you, dear viewer, could very quickly be seeing Glock ARs in your hands and in your police officers' hands rather than just over in Europe, and we can finally catch up. Again, these have been on the shelf for the last 2 years or so for certain departments and contracts in Europe. However, in the US, they've kind of been vaporware since getting them here from Europe is not always the easiest task. The follow up question to that would be to you, dear viewer, would you actually buy a $2,000 Glock AR that is an AR with a twist? $2,000 for an imported AR actually isn't that much money. Most of the times when you get an imported AR, they're a little bit more than that. $2,000 isn't the most expensive. It's probably somewhere around Daniel Defense or Geisley, still less than CAC or LMT or even Radian or some of these other rifle manufacturers. So $2,000 for a big name or one of the biggest names in firearms in the world today doesn't actually seem like that much money. Myself personally, I would be very interested in getting my hands on one of these Glock ARs should they become available in the US. However, at the end of the day, most ARs are just ARs, even if they have a few different internal niceties or complexities or interesting innovations on the AR-15 design. I played with the CACs, I played with the LMTs, and they're all very similar shades of gray when it comes to ARs, so it's probably not the most exciting thing compared to a dedicated new platform. However, Glock and radical departures from the norm don't really go hand in hand, so maybe it is best for them sticking inside of their wheelhouse of doing something that's already been done to death. So, with all that out of the way, gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. I will see you in the next one. Peace off.